The first time I saw my death, it was a dream, or so I thought. A fleeting, fractured scene of chaos and terror, fading the moment I opened my eyes. But the second time, it was clearer. The third? Crystal. Now, every time I close my eyes, I watch myself die again and again, like a movie reel I can't escape. And the worst part? The clock in the background keeps counting down, closer and closer to zero. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a nightmare. I was at my desk, the soft hum of my office computer blending with the faint chatter of distant coworkers. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets for hours, and I let them close just for a moment. That's when the world shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't in my office anymore. I was in an alley, the air thick with the smell of wet pavement and garbage. Rain pelted down, sharp and icy against my skin. My heart raced as I realized I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, my arms pinned to my sides. Then I saw myself, standing just a few feet away. My face was pale, twisted in terror, my chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. That's when I noticed the figure. It emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured and its movements deliberate. My other self stood frozen, wide-eyed with terror, as the figure crept closer. The air grew colder, and a suffocating pressure wrapped around me like an invisible force. Just as the figure reached me, everything dissolved into darkness. A chilling whisper echoed in the void. "It's not over." I jolted awake, my heart racing, the vividness of the vision lingering like a shadow in my mind. The sensation of something watching me refused to fade, but I was fine. Still, the memory lingered, vivid and sharp. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a warning. I woke the next morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My neck throbbed with phantom pain, the memory of the blade vivid and unrelenting. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, half expecting to see blood pooling at my throat. But there was nothing. Just pale skin and dark circles under hollow eyes. I tried to shake the nightmare off as I made coffee, telling myself it was just stress or exhaustion. But then I saw it, the digital clock on my microwave. The numbers glowed a vivid red, 72000. I blinked, certain I was imagining things. But the timer didn't change. It stayed frozen, an ominous countdown that made my stomach churn. I reached out to reset it, but the second my finger touched the button, the numbers began to tick backward. 71 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. 71 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds. I yanked my hand away, my breath catching. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. I grabbed it, eager for any distraction, but the message on the screen made my blood run cold. "It's starting." No sender, no number, just those two words. I dropped the phone as a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. My head whipped toward the door, my pulse racing. But when I opened it, no one was there. Instead, a black envelope lay on the floor. Inside was a single slip of paper, the same glowing numbers scrawled across it. 72 hours. The countdown wasn't just in my mind, it was everywhere, and it was getting shorter. The countdown followed me everywhere. It glowed from the microwave, my phone, even the corner of my laptop screen, as if the numbers had burned into my reality. 71 hours, 42 minutes, and counting. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. I needed answers. I started with the black envelope, hoping it would lead to a clue. The paper inside was stiff, unnatural, like it hadn't been made for human hands. The glowing numbers pulsed faintly, as if alive. My fingers trembled as I stuffed it back inside. The internet offered little comfort. Searches for countdown visions, black envelopes, and recurring death dreams brought up conspiracy theories and cryptic forums. Most of it felt like noise, until I found the thread. The post read, "Recurring visions of death? A countdown you can't escape? You're not dreaming, and it's not fate. You've been chosen. The replies were worse. People described their own countdowns, their deaths replaying vividly in their minds, growing clearer as time ticked down. Some had disappeared without explanation. Others left cryptic updates that abruptly stopped. But one response chilled me to my core. It's not your death you're seeing. It's your role in someone else's. The clock marks the moment it happens. The closer you get, the more it'll try to pull you in. A loud thunk snapped me out of my spiral. My heart pounded as I turned to the door. There it was again, the same sharp knock as before. But this time, the shadow under the door wasn't still. It moved. I crept closer, hand shaking as I reached for the knob. When I swung it open, the hallway was empty, except for another black envelope lying at my feet. Inside, the numbers had changed. 48 hours. The black envelope sat heavy in my trembling hands. The numbers glowed brighter now. 48 hours. I stared at them until they burned into my mind, their meaning growing sharper, darker. The clock wasn't just counting down. It was pulling me toward something inevitable. That night, I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion dragged me under. The visions came immediately, sharper and more vivid than before. I was back in the alley, rain pouring down in relentless sheets. I saw myself again, panicked, gasping for air, my hands raised defensively as the figure stepped closer. But this time, there was something different. The figure spoke. "You can't change this," it said, its voice distorted, a deep, guttural rasp that echoed off the alley walls. My reflection begged, shaking its head, tears mixing with the rain. "It's already done." Suddenly, I wasn't just watching. I could feel everything. The cold rain soaking through my clothes, the slick pavement under my feet, the searing pain as the blade plunged into my chest. I screamed, and the vision shattered like glass, pulling me back into my bedroom. But I wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the corner, just out of reach of the dim light from my bedside lamp. My heart hammered as I grabbed the lamp and swung it toward the darkness. Nothing. But the air was cold now, suffocating, thick with the scent of rain. I glanced at my phone. The countdown had jumped forward. 36 hours. The visions weren't waiting for sleep anymore. They were breaking into the real world. And the shadow in the corner? It was still watching. The shadow hadn't moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was alive. Watching. Waiting. My breaths came shallow as I backed out of the room, clutching my phone like it was a weapon. The countdown glowed relentlessly. 35 hours. I couldn't stay here. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in, the air suffocating. Every corner felt darker than it should, every sound amplified. I needed answers, and I was running out of time. Desperation clawed at me as I grabbed my coat and rushed out into the night. The streets were eerily empty, the streetlights casting jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I didn't know where I was going until I found myself outside my grandmother's old house, now abandoned and overgrown. She had always talked about seeing things, visions of death, warnings she claimed had saved her more than once. At the time, I thought she was crazy. Now, I wasn't so sure. The door creaked open as I stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint scent of lavender mixed with mildew hit me like a memory. Her journals were still here, buried beneath stacks of forgotten trinkets. I tore through the pages, searching for anything that made sense. Then I found it. A single line circled in red ink. To see your own death is to bind it closer. Only a mirror can send it back. My stomach dropped as the room suddenly felt colder. The shadows on the wall moved and I froze. Something shifted behind me. My reflection in the cracked mirror wasn't my own. It was me from the visions, drenched in rain, eyes wide with terror, and it whispered, "It's almost time." The mirror shimmered faintly in the dim light, its surface fractured but alive. My reflection, the other me, stared back with wide, unblinking eyes, water dripping from soaked hair and clothes that didn't match the dry room around me. My heart hammered as I backed away, but the reflection didn't move. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing its face against the glass, its lips curling into a grim smile. "You can't change this," it whispered, the voice low and raspy, a haunting echo of my own. "You were always meant to be here." I shook my head, clutching the journal tighter. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, barely audible. The reflection tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on tangled strings. "I am you," it said simply, its smile widening. "You made the deal. You set the clock. And now, it's time to pay." My blood ran cold as the words sank in. The visions weren't just warnings. They were promises. I wasn't watching my death. I was creating it. The air grew colder, and a sharp metallic tang filled the room. Behind me, the shadows on the walls writhed and stretched, their edges sharp like claws. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I didn't need to check it to know what it would say. The countdown was almost up. As I turned back to the mirror, my reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and the cracks began to spread. The cracks in the mirror spread like veins, spiderwebbing outward with each pulse of the clock in my head. I stumbled back, the journal slipping from my hands. My reflection, pushed harder against the glass, its soaked hand pressing through as if the barrier between us was thinning. Behind me, my phone buzzed on the floor. The sound was relentless, vibrating against the wood like a heartbeat. I knew without looking. The timer was down to seconds. I turned to run, but the air in the room thickened, pushing back like an invisible wall. The shadows coiled tighter, rising from the floor like living things. They whispered in voices I almost recognized, names I couldn't quite place, all weaving together into a singular command. "Stay." The reflection's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the noise. "You can't run from what you are." The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, and I fell to my knees, shards scattering around me. I felt it before I saw it, me, stepping out of the glass, drenched and smiling. Its footsteps echoed as it approached, the knife glinting in its hand. I reached for the phone, desperate for time. The screen glowed. Too late. The last thing I heard was the sound of my own voice whispering, "Welcome home." I gasped awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain hammered against the window, matching the rhythm of my pulse. My hands instinctively went to my neck, no blood, no wound, but the phantom pain lingered, sharp and searing. I was in my apartment again, but something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. On the floor, my phone buzzed incessantly. I hesitated before picking it up. The screen glowed with an all-too-familiar sight. The countdown had restarted. A faint laugh echoed from the corner, and as I turned, I saw it. Me, standing in the shadows, smiling. Do you dare close your eyes tonight? What would you see if your death waited for you behind your eyelids? What if every dream you've ever had wasn't a dream at all, but a glimpse of your end? Are you ready to face it? The first night, I thought it was an earthquake. Just a brief, violent tremor that jolted me awake at exactly 3 a.m. But when the shaking happened the next night, and the night after that, I realized this wasn't something natural. Something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. And now, I'm afraid to sleep. The first time it happened, I was ripped from a deep sleep by the sensation of my bed shaking violently beneath me. It wasn't subtle, no gentle vibration or faint rumble. The mattress jolted as if something beneath it was trying to escape, throwing me upright with a gasp. The room was dark, the shadows deeper than I remembered. My phone's screen glared back at me as I fumbled for it on the nightstand. 3 a.m. I sat frozen, clutching the blanket tightly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. An earthquake? I listened, but the apartment was silent. No rattling windows, no distant rumble. Just my uneven breaths and the creak of the old wooden floor as the room seemed to shift around me. The shaking stopped, but the unease lingered. I reached for the lamp. my hand trembling as I flicked it on. Warm light flooded the room, but it did nothing to dispel the chill crawling up my spine. I leaned down, peering under the bed. Empty. Just the dull wood of the floor and a few forgotten dust bunnies. I told myself it was nothing, a stress-induced nightmare. But as I lay back down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something had been there, watching. The clock ticked forward, the numbers glowing in the dim room. 3 a.m. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next night I stayed awake, determined to prove the previous night had been a one-time fluke. But at 3 a.m., like clockwork, the bed began to shake again. This time, I was ready. Or at least, I thought I was. The trembling was more violent, the bed frame creaking as though it might splinter under the force. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin as I gripped the mattress, willing it to stop. It didn't. Instead, something worse happened. I noticed the air in the room, still and heavy, almost suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, pooling unnaturally, writhing as if alive. I felt a presence, unseen but undeniable, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I forced myself to move, flicking on the lamp. The shaking stopped immediately, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The shadows returned to their corners, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The following night, I tried something different. I kept the lights on, refusing to let the darkness take over. But at exactly 3 a.m., the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. The bed shook harder than ever, the lamp falling off the nightstand with a crash. The whispers started then, faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, insistent, demanding. I sat frozen in terror, clinging to the sheets as the bed stilled. My phone screen lit up on the floor, the clock glowing mockingly. 3:01 a.m. The pattern was undeniable now. This wasn't random. It wasn't normal. And it wasn't stopping. By the fourth night, my nerves were frayed. The whispers haunted me long after the bed stopped shaking, their low murmurs replaying in my mind throughout the day. My apartment felt hostile, the air dense with a quiet tension. I needed answers. The first person I turned to was my landlord, Mr. Carson. I cornered him in the hallway, my voice trembling as I recounted the events. His face darkened, his usual gruff demeanor giving way to unease. "You're in 2B, right?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yes," I said quickly. "What's wrong with it?" He hesitated, his gaze darting down the hall as if afraid someone might overhear. "That unit's got a history," he muttered. "Strange things happen there. Always have." "What kind of strange things?" I pressed. He refused to elaborate, shaking his head. "Best advice? Move out. Some things aren't worth sticking around for." His words only deepened my unease. That night, desperate for more, I turned to the internet. I scoured forums and old articles until I stumbled upon a chilling connection. Years ago, a woman in my apartment had reported the same nightly shaking. She'd claimed to see shadows and hear voices too. The article ended abruptly, with no resolution. But one line stuck with me. The disturbances stopped when the tenant disappeared. Disappeared. My stomach churned as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The shaking wasn't random. It wasn't a haunting. It was a warning. The landlord's words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. What had he meant by a history? What happened to the people who lived here before me? The question clung to me like a shadow. I needed answers. That evening, I dove into my laptop, scouring the internet for anything tied to my address. The screen's glow was the only light in the room, every corner shrouded in a darkness that felt alive. My search pulled up fragments at first, old rental listings, mundane property records. But then I stumbled across something darker. An article, yellowed with age in the online archive, told of a woman who had lived in my unit a decade ago. Her story was eerily familiar: nightly disturbances, whispers, and a bed that shook violently at precisely 3 a.m. The article's tone shifted as I read on. The woman had sought help from friends, the police, even a priest, but nothing stopped the nightly events. She reported seeing shadows in her room, figures she couldn't describe but knew weren't human. The last entry in the piece chilled me. The tenant disappeared, leaving behind all her belongings. No evidence of foul play was found, but the case remains open. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. This wasn't just happening to me. It had happened before. And it didn't end well. The air grew colder, and I froze as the sound of faint scratching came from my bedroom. My eyes darted to the clock. 2:59 a.m. My stomach dropped. This time I wasn't just reading about history. I was about to become part of it. The scratching grew louder, relentless, as though something was clawing its way out of the walls. My heart pounded as I crept toward the bedroom, each step heavier than the last. The clock on my phone ticked closer to 3 a.m., its glow casting jagged shadows across my trembling hands. When I reached the doorway, the air in the room was different, thicker, colder. The bed was still, but the feeling of being watched pressed down on me like a physical weight. My breath caught as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. A shadow moved at the foot of the bed. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired mind. But as I stepped closer, it solidified. Taller than a person, its edges rippling unnaturally. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the doorframe for support. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating, oppressive. "Who's there?" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the shadows, came a faint whisper. "Help us." The words sent a chill through me, my legs frozen in place. The figure shifted, as if struggling to maintain its form. I thought I saw a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, flickering in and out of focus. The clock on the nightstand struck 3 a.m., and the bed began to shake violently. This time I didn't need to see it to know the presence wasn't just watching anymore. It was trying to reach me. The bed shook violently, the force rattling the lamp on my nightstand and sending it crashing to the floor. The shadow at the foot of the bed grew darker, denser, until it felt like the room was collapsing under its weight. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I stumbled backward, clutching the doorframe for balance. "Stop!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The air turned icy, my words evaporating into silence. Then, from the heart of the shadow, the whisper returned, louder now, almost human. "Help us, before it takes you too." My blood turned cold. "What's taking me? Who are you?" My words tumbled out in desperation, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved, slowly, unnaturally, shifting closer as the bed stilled. Its edges rippled, its face flickering in and out of focus, gaunt and hollow-eyed. "Help us," it repeated, its voice layered, like many speaking at once. The pressure in the room grew unbearable. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows writhing and stretching toward me. My legs buckled and I sank to the floor, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. Then, just as I felt I couldn't breathe, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The shadow was gone. I crawled to my phone, the screen cracked and flickering. The clock read 3:15 a.m., but I knew it wasn't over. The air still felt heavy and I could hear faint scratching, coming from under the bed. The scratching under the bed grew louder, sharper, as if nails were raking against the wood. My hands trembled as I crawled closer, peering into the darkness beneath. The faint light from the shattered lamp barely reached the edges, but I could see something moving, small, quick, darting in and out of view. I pulled back, my heart hammering, but before I could move, A cold gust swept over me. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with a low guttural whisper. "Look closer," it said. The words crawling into my ears like insects. My body moved before my mind could stop it. I reached under the bed, my hand groping through the darkness. The wood beneath my fingers felt wet, sticky. I recoiled, pulling my hand back, only to find it covered in something dark and glistening. Blood. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. But then I saw it, a flash of pale skin, a face staring back at me from the shadows under the bed. It was mine. I scrambled back, my breath hitching as the figure under the bed mirrored my every movement. Its lips twisted into a smile that didn't belong to me, eyes hollow and brimming with malice. The whispers rose again, louder now, coming from all directions. "You are next," they chanted, their voices overlapping, a chorus of despair. I backed into the wall, shaking, as the clock on my phone blinked. 3:59 a.m. Time was running out. The face under the bed didn't vanish. It lingered, its hollow eyes locked on mine, unblinking. The whispers swelled, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, each more desperate and angry than the last. My back pressed into the wall, every muscle frozen with terror. The clock on my phone flashed 4 a.m. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and absolute. I thought it was over. Then the bed creaked, the mattress sinking as if something heavy was climbing onto it. Slowly, impossibly, I felt the weight shift toward me. I turned to run, but the shadows stretched out, gripping my ankles like living chains. I fell, clawing at the floor as the cold, wet presence of something unseen loomed closer. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the window. The room was still. But the clock blinked 3 a.m., frozen, waiting. It always does. Would you stay in a haunted apartment if it meant facing something darker than death? If this story gave you chills, share it. But beware. It might bring the whispers closer to you. Are you sure your bed is still tonight? Or is something waiting for 3 a.m. to find you? It started with a single line, typed on aged paper that smelled of mildew and time. "I'm still here." I found the words waiting on the old typewriter I'd purchased at a yard sale. I thought it was a prank, some mechanical glitch, but every night since, the letters have continued. Messages from people I've never met, telling me secrets no one living should know. It was a cool Saturday morning when I stumbled upon the typewriter. The sale was nothing special. Old furniture, dusty trinkets, the kind of things people cleared out of their attics after decades. But the typewriter caught my eye immediately. Its sleek black casing, chipped with age, stood out among the clutter. "Does it work?" I asked the elderly woman running the sale. She hesitated. "It's old, but it types. Came with the house when I moved in. Take it for $10 if you want it." It was a steal. I hauled it home, the satisfying weight of it in my hands giving me a strange sense of nostalgia. I hadn't typed on a typewriter in years, and I looked forward to the satisfying clack of the keys. That night, after setting it up in my small office, I went to bed. When I returned the next morning, the blank sheet I'd left in the machine wasn't blank anymore. It read, "I'm still here." I stared at the typewriter, my chest tightening with every passing second. I lived alone. No one could have typed that message. My hands trembled as I inspected the machine, half expecting to find some hidden mechanism or explanation. But the keys were still, their metallic surfaces dulled with age. It was just an ordinary typewriter, or so I thought. My phone buzzed on the desk, startling me. It was a text from Alex. "Hey, you okay? Haven't heard from you." I didn't answer. How could I explain this? The words on the paper felt alive, staring back at me. "I'm still here." I tried to brush it off as a prank, though I had no idea how anyone could have done it. That night, I avoided the office altogether, hoping distance would calm my nerves. But when I returned in the morning, a new message awaited me, typed neatly on fresh paper. This one read, "You've opened the door." My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the typewriter since yesterday. The air in the room felt heavier, the shadows deeper. I suddenly realized this wasn't a prank or my imagination. Something had found its way to me. I couldn't shake the unease the typewriter brought into my home. I needed answers. The next night, I slid a fresh sheet of paper into the machine and sat before it, the room silent except for the faint hum of the overhead light. My fingers hovered over the keys before I finally typed, "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing happened. I felt foolish, staring at the blank page, waiting for something impossible. Then, the keys began to move on their own. The sound of each keystroke echoed through the room, sharp and deliberate. My breath caught as words appeared, letter by letter. Someone who didn't finish. My heart raced. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, a cold draft brushing against my skin. "Didn't finish what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I pressed the question into the machine, each word harder to type as my hands shook. This time the response was immediate, the keys clattering with unnatural urgency. Life. The finality of the word sent a chill through me. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Whatever or whoever was using this typewriter wasn't just playing games. It was trying to tell me something. The typewriter's letters became more frequent, filling my apartment with a growing sense of dread. Some messages were vague and cryptic, others sharp and accusatory. But the ones that unnerved me the most were the personal ones. Letters that seemed to know more about the people around me than I did. One night, the typewriter left a simple message. "Tell Sarah I forgive her." The name stopped me cold. I didn't know anyone named Sarah. At least I thought I didn't. The next morning, as I left my apartment, I noticed a folded note shoved under my door. It was from my neighbor, the one I barely knew. Her name? Sarah. She told me about her brother, how he'd passed away in a tragic car accident weeks earlier. The guilt in her voice was unmistakable. "I keep asking for a sign," she confessed, tears in her eyes. "Anything to tell me he's at peace." I handed her the message from the typewriter, hesitant but compelled to share it. Her hands trembled as she read the words. "This? How did you know?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't," I said softly, my unease growing. The typewriter knew, and now so did she. The letters kept coming, and each one brought a deeper chill. Some shared mundane details about lives long past, while others hinted at regrets and tragedies too heavy to ignore. One night, as the keys clacked away, the message stopped me in my tracks. "You have to help me. He's still here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's here?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky. I slid a fresh sheet into the typewriter and typed the same question. For minutes, there was silence, but the air in the room felt thicker, colder. Finally, the typewriter clattered to life again. "He's watching." I froze, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, almost alive, shifting ever so slightly. My chest tightened as I felt a faint breath of cold air brush past my neck. Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of the typewriter. My search led me to a reclusive writer named Harold Grayson. Decades ago, he lived in my town, spending his life obsessed with communicating with the dead. He owned a typewriter, a black Remington, eerily similar to mine. The next letter read, "You found me." The more I dug into the typewriter's history, the darker the story became. My search led me to Harold Grayson, a reclusive writer who once lived in the very house I now called home. Decades ago, Harold had spent years researching the afterlife, claiming he could communicate with spirits through his writing. His obsession consumed him, driving away friends and family. He died alone, found slumped over his desk, his final manuscript unfinished. The details were chilling. He owned a typewriter, a black Remington just like mine. Witnesses reported he believed it wasn't just a tool for his writing, but a doorway to the other side. That night, I returned home to find the typewriter waiting for me. A fresh page had been fed into the machine, the keys already at work. I froze as the letters formed a single line. You found me. The air in the room turned icy, and the floor creaked under invisible weight. I backed away, my pulse quickening, but the typewriter didn't stop. The keys clattered on, typing the same phrase again. You found me. Harold wasn't just a story from the past. Somehow, he was still here, and he knew I was too. The typewriter began to piece together Harold's story, as though it wanted me to understand. Each night it typed fragments of his life, recounting how he'd spent years trying to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. He believed the typewriter wasn't just a tool but a medium, a doorway for those trapped on the other side. Harold's obsession consumed him. The letters described how he lost his family and friends, each one leaving as he grew more consumed by the voices he claimed to hear. They said I was mad, one message read. I thought I was helping. One night I couldn't resist typing back, "Why did it stop? Why are you still here?" The keys clattered furiously, almost angry in their response. I didn't listen. Now it's too late. A chill ran through me as I hesitated before typing my next question. Too late for what? The typewriter paused, and the silence in the room grew oppressive. When it began typing again, each letter felt deliberate, almost reluctant. To stop him. I stared at the words, heart pounding. This wasn't just Harold's story anymore. Something darker had taken hold, and I was in its path. The typewriter grew relentless, clattering at all hours, each letter echoing louder than the last. The messages became frantic, fragmented, as if written in panic. Shadows crept at the edges of my vision, darting away when I turned my head. One night, as I sat watching the keys move on their own, the air turned icy. My breath fogged in front of me, and then I felt it, a cold, weightless hand pressing down on my shoulder. I froze, too terrified to move. Slowly I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing, just empty space. The typewriter stopped, the room eerily silent. On the fresh sheet of paper, a single line had been typed, "He's coming." The shadows around me seemed to shift, as though something had already arrived. The typewriter groaned, each keystroke thunderous in the silence. The message read, "You must finish what he started." The shadows in the room shifted, pooling together into a figure, tall, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. It was Harold, or what was left of him. "You're the door now," he rasped, his voice low and broken. "You've let them through." The lights flickered, and the typewriter clattered wildly, spitting out warnings and desperate pleas. My breath hitched as Harold stepped closer, his figure dissolving into the encroaching darkness. Then, the room fell silent. But the door, it had opened. I left the apartment the next day, abandoning the typewriter, but the letters followed. Sheets of paper appeared on my desk, my kitchen counter, even my bed, each filled with haunting messages I couldn't ignore. I burned them, shredded them, but they returned, unscathed. The typewriter appeared in my new home a week later, its keys still, waiting. Now, every night, it types a single line. This is your story now. I wonder if I'll ever escape, or if the typewriter has claimed me as its next tale to tell. If this story made you shiver, share it. But be warned, sometimes stories have a way of finding you. Would you dare type a message on that typewriter? What would it write back to you?